More than 1.43 billion babies worldwide since 1980 have been aborted. What happens to all these innocent, immortal souls that only have the stain of original sin? Can they ever get to heaven? Can they be purified in purgatory? After all, their most fundamental right was taken away. Love your program, and this is from Raymond. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe it's Raymond Arroyo. Maybe
good.
Ray heard, was checking in and wanted to throw a curveball at you there, Father. We hear that a lot. People wonder, what is the status of a child like that? I mean, years ago, in some ways, limbo was a place that had been posited, etc. And then people go back and forth to how it would work. Go ahead.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, those little children are in heaven, no question about it. They are, though they have the stain of original sin. Originally, it was thought that maybe they were put into a separate place called limbo because they had not been baptized. At the Second Vatican Council, that position was actually formally, rescinded. By the way, that was just a theological opinion. That was not a doctrine. Limbo was never a doctrine in the Catholic Church. It's a theological opinion, and that was actually rescinded. And now we hold that those children are, because they are innocent, because they were killed unjustly, they would have the same status as the holy innocents, right, who were slaughtered, because of the arrival of Jesus. And so for all intents and purposes, we believe that every last one of them is with the Lord in heaven, and of course expressing, they are able to express the fullness of who they would have become because their souls, right, are full human souls, right? So their souls are completely there, and so they're going to be allowed to develop in some way. We don't know how that occurs, whether they experience some kind of childhood in heaven or what, but we know that they will be, all of them, brought into the heavenly kingdom. That, of course, doesn't excuse the fact that we have a moral and ethical obligation to protect those human beings, because that's how God intended, human beings to have the possibility of a biological life with parents and so forth, and not to be killed prematurely. And there's very good reasons for that, but the point is that doesn't excuse anything. But yes, God does, in His unconditionally loving mercy, take them all up to Himself. So what's kind of interesting, is that little kids who have near-death experiences, are little kids who undergo clinical death. So if a child drowns or they have a heart attack or something of that nature, 85% of children have a very positive near-death experience. Only 15% are not able to remember that anything happened to them. It's just the reverse for adults. 80% of adults don't remember anything after clinical death. 20% have a positive near-death experience. So we do know God does very much care about children, not just because of near-death experiences, but because of Jesus' own declaration, right? Beware of what you do to these little kids, right? Because their angels are looking into my heavenly Father's face. So He cares very, very much about them.
Better to have a millstone around your neck,
warns,
I think, was the maybe
exactly.
On that one, right? Well, let me ask you that, because you touched on that, and it's obviously ridiculous, but sometimes when we get into, you hear people, when they try to make it into some degree a religious argument, which they do about abortion and things like that, they say, well, as Father just said, since these children end up going to heaven anyway, so that's a wonderful eternal outcome for them, and this young lady gets to avoid having to deal with this so she can deal with her life better here. Why is that a bad outcome?
Yeah, because it's morally bankrupt. I mean, we are responsible as human beings for a code of just ethical behavior, just in the sense of justice, right? So the very minimum that we are expected to do is to follow what's called the silver rule. The golden rule is a high standard. The silver rule is the minimum ethical standard which is expected of every human being and written into the conscience of every human being. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Don't do an unnecessary harm to others that you would not want done to you. In other words, if a harm to another human being is avoidable, right, then avoid it. And if a harm is unavoidable, right, something happens, the economy bottoms out, you have to lay somebody off, you're in an automobile, you can't stop it in time. If a harm is unavoidable, then minimize it. That's our least ethical option. And even brute utilitarians like Thomas Hobbes would say immediately, right, if you're not going to abide by the silver rule, if you're not going to abide by what's called the principle of non-maleficence, don't do unnecessary harms to others, and if a harm is unavoidable, minimize it. If you're not going to abide by that, then life is going to be brutish, ugly, and short. My shorthand way of looking at this is, if you have a friend who says, you know, I really need to do unnecessary harms to people in order to be fulfilled in life. I just need to kill some of my children in order to be fulfilled in life. Run, Bambi, run. Because you're dealing with someone who's devoid of conscience, which psychiatrists call a sociopath. Right, yeah. You know, run, Bambi, run. Right. Of course we know this. It's written not just into the religious law, it is written, as St. Paul tells us, into our consciences, into our hearts. The whole, you know, our whole legal system is based upon the distinction between malum in se and malum prohibita, right? In other words, that we know the distinction between something that is evil in itself, something which is unjust, something which is unnecessary, something which causes unjust harm. We know this is wrong to do if it's unnecessary. And for all intents and purposes, the law makes no excuse, right? Whether the ignorance is no excuse for the law when you're dealing with malum and se. When something is evil in itself, the law presumes, not the church, the law presumes you have a conscience, the law presumes you must know, and therefore the law presumes that ignorance is no excuse for your not knowing it. You must know it, you're responsible. Now, malum prohibita, like don't go through a red light. Red lights mean to stop. Yes, you would need some education in our culture in order to know something like that. You could be held, you could, be excused from you know, by you're committing that kind of a crime. You could be excused because of ignorance. Ignorance, therefore, is an excuse for not obeying the law with malum prohibita, but not for malum in se.
Well, is that the reason you think, because, like you said, in a sense, it's innate to us, why there's so much anger, at least attached to this issue for some people, certainly on the people who tend to defend the ability to do it? Is that why there's always seems to be such anger involved?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you see a lot of moral indignation and outrage towards something which is completely unethical and wrong, for example, the pro-life people, there is anger there because people really do feel like people should know that, just because a baby is in utero doesn't give you an excuse to kill the baby in utero any more than it would give you an excuse outside the womb to kill that baby. Partial birth abortion is so, exemplifies, the outrage so much that people are just going, how can this be excused? This is clearly a case of an unjustifiable, unnecessary harm, namely the taking of another human life. How can you possibly justify this? this under any circumstances simply because the baby is in utero. It makes no sense. And of course, yes, we do get outraged at it, and we got to calm that so we can try and get into people's heads and rationally explain why it is wrong, because our culture has literally planted a seed by giving legal sanction, legal justification to this crime. Now, here's the basic logic that people follow. If something becomes legal, it becomes normal. And if it becomes normal, it becomes moral. Why? If you give something legal sanction, then people will start doing it feeling that the legal sanction is a moral or ethical sanction. And of course, if they start doing it in great numbers, which they have in the case of abortion, it seems to be moral because everybody's doing it.
Now, let me ask you that.
This is a big
Let me
problem.
ask you that point, because you point that out. Is that a unique problem kind of to the American mindset, or is that something we've seen around the world and throughout other cultures? What's your thought?
I think it is very, very normal in Western culture, and certainly in some Asian cultures, and certainly in the United States, where the law is so highly respected. Remember, in our culture, the law is associated with justice. It's associated with this high principle. And by the way, it was St. Augustine that did this. It's not because the Roman law was so powerful, right? But because of Augustine's dictum, right? That an unjust law is no law at all. In other words, what Augustine was saying is that every positive law, a positive law is a kind of law that's passed by a legislature, or a kind of law that is becomes a law because of legal precedent, etc. That kind of positive law must always correspond to the higher principle of justice, right? To give every human being their due, to not cause any human being an unnecessary harm, right? This is minimal justice. Now, the whole idea of justice being higher than the law, given to us by St. Augustine, was snapped up in the European world, and of course, because it was, the law was enshrined with a dignity. The law was portrayed with statues of, liberty, or justice, who is wearing a blindfold with the scales and so forth. Right? Justice and the law, right in front of the Supreme Court, you have that very statue of Justice herself, blindfolded with the scales, right, of this idea that justice is the guiding principle of law, a noble thing indeed. And of course, do I think that justice is noble? I do think justice is noble. I think it is, in its enfleshment, in equity, and the whole area of equity and evidence and so forth. I think justice is so noble, it moves my heart, and that's why I allow the law to move my heart. And Augustine saw the same thing too, but he also recognized that if the law does not follow justice, that is to say, if the law abrogates that principle of do no unnecessary harm, the principle of non-maleficence, if it abrogates, the idea of giving every human being what they deserve and are due because of the work or the time spent in the work that they have, done, if the law is going to abrogate justice, then it is no law at all. And of course, as you probably know, I mean, this principle has been used again and again and again in every act of civil disobedience. It was certainly quoted by Thomas Jefferson. It was certainly quoted by Martin Luther King in the Birmingham Letter. It was certainly quoted by Gandhi again and again. I mean, it just comes from St. Augustine. But for all intents purposes, that's why we give the law this powerful moral force within our culture, because we believe it is commensurate and consistent with justice. But in point of fact, if it is not, then that law is not a law. The people who passed that law have abdicated their responsibility of being those who are responsible for justice, and not the arbitrary passage of laws which the powerful or the influential in the culture have pressured the poor justices to uphold. For all intents and purposes, they've abrogated their duty, not just the duty to the people of the United States, not just the duty to the innocents who will be harmed by this abrogation of justice, but their duty to justice itself. I mean, the outrage is so significant. Well, I mean, these guys think that they are simply not morally responsible, and it's just amazing
isn't it,
that they can sit back and pretend it innocence.
Right.